Hear these words from James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will face stricter judgment. For all of us make mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is mature, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they are so large and driven by strong winds, yet they are guided by a very small rudder, and wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of life, and is itself set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse people made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth comes forth blessing and a curse. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives or a grapevine fig? No more can salt water yield fresh. Thanks be to God for this living word. I'm not sure how universal this is, but I imagine that many people had sayings that their parents told them time and time again when they were children that were just utterly annoying to hear when they were a kid. My mom often talks about the chores that she had to do growing up, particularly her least favorite task, which was doing the dishes after dinner, the seemingly endless dishes, with her sisters. Despite her distaste for this job, her mother would encourage her to work together with her sisters to make the job easier. Now, when my mom tells this story, she adopts the same sneering, mocking attitude that she and her sisters surely had when they were kids and their mother left the room. She'd say, "Many hands make light work. Many hands make light work." I don't know if you've heard that story. Many hands make light work. Saying, many hands make light work. Now, I'll say that's pretty good advice overall. Yes, if you adopt a role in that line of dishwashing duties, it'll go by quicker. But I also understand it's not exactly what you want to hear when you're a kid who feels like an injustice is occurring. But like I said, I imagine others can think of those same sayings that bugged you as a kid that you heard from your parents from time to time. And of course, the irony is that my mom had plenty of her own sayings that rubbed me the wrong way. Though she didn't ever tell us kids that many hands make light work. That clearly had too big of an effect on her. For me, though, the absolute worst one to hear was, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Yes. I don't know what it was about that one, but I don't think it ever once helped me get in a better mood. And right off the bat, I do want to say about that saying that it's not actually universally applicable advice. Sometimes the prophetic words that God has placed on our hearts are not necessarily what we would call nice, though they are always motivated by love. Sometimes the things we have to say to call out injustices are not nice and will not be received well. But I do actually think that's an important distinction for James as well, because he never really clarifies what he means about being careful with what we say. He isn't necessarily suggesting we follow that if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all rule. But I think we all kind of know what James means when he says that it can feel sometimes as though we are ruled by our tongue and not the other way around. We know that feeling when we've said something hurtful, willingly or not, or when we just slip out something dumb that we wish we could take back. So while I think it might be a better paraphrase to say that James is saying, if you don't have anything motivated by love and appropriate for the context and generally helpful to say, don't say anything at all. I do still think that we could all agree with James that this is a universal problem. No one has fully mastered their tongue. And he does mean this universally, even though he begins with that warning, warning those teachers about their greater influence and greater judgment to follow. He does quickly turn to everyone's speech. And plus, as a church that speaks about the priesthood of all believers, we're all on the hook here, unfortunately. To make his point clear, James employs several metaphors for the tongue. And I'm sure you saw during that reading just how quickly he jumps from one image to another. So today what I'd like to do in our time today is to walk through each of these metaphors that he gives with some examples and extrapolations to get at the heart of why the tongue is so important for James. Because at first glance, this section seems a little out of place from what we've been reading so far. He's been talking about works and faith and a lot about wealth, yet here he devotes a whole chapter to the topic. Now for the first metaphor, James calls the tongue a bridle for the body, like the bits that go in the mouth of a horse, a very small object that can actually lead the whole horse in the direction that it will go. Or like the huge boat redirected by the small rudder. The tongue is small and unassuming, but is actually what leads us in the direction that we go. Now, as good rationalists, all of us living after the Enlightenment, we might want to correct James and tell him that actually we're led by our brains, not by our tongues. And we reason out what actions we're going to take and who we're going to be in the world. But the pre-modern James actually has something to teach us here. Our speech is not always so rational as we might think it is, but sometimes it seems to bubble forth unconsciously. And as much as we like to think of ourselves as logical people who hold all of our beliefs for logical reasons, weighing all the facts all the time, the reality is we're more likely to make a decision based on a nebulous set of values that we hold. Perhaps you felt this with your own speech, where something comes out that you didn't expect to, sometimes for good or sometimes not. But I've heard it said, and I think it's often true, that we sometimes don't know what we think about a particular issue until we actually open our mouth to speak about it. Then it becomes a battle of our internal values, our particular mood we find ourselves in, and the social context that we live in, to determine what it is that our tongue is actually going to let loose. And we are indeed led by that speech. It shapes us and our beliefs more than we'd like to admit. That's why it can be such a helpful practice to actually say good things out loud. That's why we pray out loud sometimes, praying the Lord's Prayer together as we will later in the service. Or why it feels necessary for us to do so sometimes in prayer, even though God can surely hear us without those spoken words. That's why reading a text out loud can change the way that you incorporate it into yourself. It's why we speak words of unison during worship. Our speech does actually drive us, for good or for ill. And that's especially true, I think, in the way that we talk about ourselves. We often will use our harshest words inwardly, saying things that you would never say to someone else. How often, though, do you actually allow yourself to give yourself some praise, some real verbal, out loud praise? Humbly, of course, but actually out loud. I am a beloved child of God. I am strong. I am beautiful. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. So our speech steers us by radically shaping our perception of the world, whether we are aware of it or not. And this can affect us at an extremely personal, internal level. But we know from the rest of the book of James that he's very focused on the interpersonal level and our actions in the world outside of ourselves. Perhaps that's why the tongue is so important to James. The tongue steers us because it is the medium through which we connect with other people. Communication is the site of interaction that makes our interconnectedness that's already there become realized to us. The tongue steers us because our words leave us and enter into a world of others who will hear our words. And those words will have an effect on them too. Thus, James gives a second metaphor for the tongue: fire. This is a fire that starts small and can ignite a large blaze. In fact, James says that the tongue actually sets on fire the whole cycle of life. Everything is consumed by these flames. If you've ever seen a video of a wildfire moving through a prairie, you know just how fast it can move. So too is it with our tongues. What we say takes on a life of its own after it has left our lips, and we cannot reel it back in. In the past few weeks, a lie has spread like wildfire throughout the United States. Motivated by racism and xenophobia, an immigrant community in Springfield, Ohio, has become the target of dangerous rhetoric. And it is indeed dangerous because threats have been made against schools, against city employees. The allegations against the Haitian immigrant community came from hearsay and were grounded firmly in distrust of anyone who is different from us in any way. I first saw some of these rumors floating around online where they were relatively widespread, but admittedly not something that most Americans had heard about. That, of course, changed quickly last week, and this unknown town suddenly became front and center in America for debate, for further rumors, and for threats of violence. Unfortunately, this sort of rhetoric is used politically in the political sphere as a way of seizing power and inciting fear. By creating a clear divide between who is in and who is out, who is safe and who is a threat, a separate group identity is formed based only on who it excludes. That structures power for a select few. And it's unfortunately been effective for many. The affective characteristic of the allegations, the emotional ones, are meant to incite an emotional response in those who hear it. But behind that hateful rhetoric was no substance, only rumors. One of the first to spread this on social media was a woman in Springfield who made a post on Facebook. After the story grew to national proportion, she admitted to NBC that it was purely conjecture and that it was baseless. She said, quote, "It just exploded into something I didn't mean to happen." Indeed, how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. Because James is so concerned about the communal nature of our tongues and its use in communicating and connecting, I think it's safe to say that when we read that word tongue, we shouldn't only think about speech, about verbal speech, but all forms of communication, including the modern forms that it can take, and through which we often feel anonymous or at least disconnected from the person that we're speaking with. James's words are not just for our tongues, but probably especially today for our thumbs and our fingers on social media and in text messages and every form of communication that is so much faster than it once was. Firing off a quick response on social media, or, like I have done in the past admittedly, carefully stewing over the perfect response for far too long, is what comes to mind when I think of James's next comparison. which is to all of the animals that humans have managed to tame. Somehow humans have been able to form a relationship with animals so that they can live in harmony and the animals will even obey humans. But, he says, we have not been able to do the same for our tongues. It's a little reassuring, I think, that James says that no one has fully been able to tame their tongue. No one is perfect, and as much as we do to change our habits, that temptation is always there. The best thing I think we can do is remove that temptation from ourselves and train ourselves to see the real impact of our words. Sometimes that can mean completely avoiding social media. The next best thing, I think, is to take responsibility for our hurtful words when we do say them, and we will, to genuinely apologize and make right when we mess up. And then finally, James's last comparison is to a spring of water, which cannot produce both fresh and salty water, or the fig tree, which can only produce figs, not olives. In one of the most convicting verses, I think, in all of the Bible, James says that with our mouths we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse people made in the likeness of God. In the same lineage as the prophets before him, James reminds us that our worship can indeed be unsightly to God. It can be meaningless. And James takes humanity's identity as the image and likeness of God very seriously. All are made in God's likeness, and therefore all carry God with them. All are made holy by God. All are beloved children of God. I spoke last week about this Kingian nonviolence training that I've begun with Honor of Peace this month. And I've been surprised by how much overlap and how much resonance there has been with the book of James. And so I'll close today with the third principle of Kingian nonviolence that they teach, which is attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil. This principle is motivated by that desire to get actual change done and not to get caught up on those personality games that we like to play, which can compromise our moral consistency, I think. But it's also motivated by this truth, that we are stuck with Jesus' difficult words to love neighbor and enemy. That doesn't mean we don't call out injustice. That doesn't mean that people that do evil are allowed to remain in power, but it does mean that we don't take up arms against them to get our own way. It means that we don't resort to personal attacks or talking about someone's appearance or anything like that, but take aims instead at the evils that are being committed that we wish to see changed in the world. The tongue is a small rudder that steers the great ship. The tongue is a fire that can grow quickly. The tongue cannot be tamed like an animal. The tongue can pour forth blessings and curses, unlike a tree, which produces one fruit. I don't know about you, but James's words call me to silence, to reflection. Not forever. We shouldn't be afraid to open our mouths and speak again, but to sit in silence before God, to rethink our words, and to become a little bit more careful with what we produce. To do so, we must adopt James's perspective, or his words fall flat. We must see others as James does, as God does, as people made in the likeness of God.